at language in the internet, looking at artificial languages. So, this is always a very interesting topic just because we are seeing language on the internet kind of evolve around our very eyes. So we're able to see language change based on how it's categorized. And the internet provides a fascinating repository of all of the types of language change that we have because everything is written or it's recorded and it's cataloged in this kind of linear format. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about what are some constructed languages that people have used, and then what are they? Are they still in effect today? So let's look at types of languages that are being used on the internet. In the previous lecture, we talked about English as a global language, and we said that English, was a hegemony on the internet. A lot of people use English for internet communication. So we'll be talking a little bit about, what are some other languages being used and how people can construct English to write in this way. Internet writing may be very different from the writing that you do for your classes. There could be a special type of internet dialect, so a particular kind of register that people would use only in an online sphere. We'll be talking about emojis. Are emojis a language? Can they represent a whole pattern of speech sounds that evoke emotion or a response? And we'll be also discussing some of the conversations regarding what are ways in which people can communicate. So, internet language can include emails, it could include message boards, some of the posts that you have on Twitter or Facebook, chat rooms, texts, comments. They always say don't look at the comments on YouTube, right? But it's very interesting because when I was putting together this lecture, I was looking up some artificial languages, and the comments on YouTube were actually very nice. They were like, "Oh my gosh, this language sounds better. I want to speak this language." And I was like, "What kind of universe am I in where the comments are nice?" But these could all be considered parts of the internet language. And so the ways in which we look at internet writing could be a different kind of register. We'll also talk about register in the next lecture, but think of register as a language for a specific purpose. So when you write on the internet, like I said, it's very different from the types of writing that you do in your everyday life. When you write on the internet, think about the ways in which it sounds a lot like how you talk, right? So maybe you're using some of those formal or informal language patterns in your writing. Or it could be something that's very formal. So, how you write in an email could be very different from how you are referencing things on the social media platform. So in the beginning, speech and writing were very different. Writing was something that was a little bit more conservative. You would use quote unquote proper, even though, we try to debunk that during this class. Language usage and speech was something that was geared more towards an informal audience. And speech was something that changed all the time. But these distinctions between speech, talking, and writing, they change with the internet because we're able to see the ways in which people speak in or write in a very informal tone on the internet, and also how what are some ways in which the internet can also influence how you speak in regular everyday life. So, how is internet writing different from the types of writing that you use in your formal papers, for example? Well, first of all, it's asynchronous, but it's also instant. So, anyone can write a comment. You probably don't remember this, but back in the day, all of your comments on Facebook, if you wrote a comment, it was on people's walls, right? So you would go on to someone's page and you would write a comment on their wall, and so sometimes you couldn't really follow the thread of what was happening because you had to kind of switch back and forth between these walls. And so it was very it's any time, any asynchronous. At any point, someone can go on and write a message at 2 a.m. and someone would check it at 5 a.m. But this is something to where it would automatically pop up. Internet can be public or private. The types of writing that we do on social media sites are being heavily contested today because a lot of people believe that it's in the public domain, right? So the things that you write for your Facebook friends, you might think is private, but the U.S. government might think it's public. So it kind of blurs these distinctions between what we think we own or what we think is for a selected audience, and the internet writing that we participate in might be more of a public kind of interface. It could be multimodal. So instead of writing, something, we're sharing memes, or we're sharing these referring back to what Saussure called the signs and the signified. We're sharing these different signs, and they have very different meanings nowadays. We're sharing gifs or gifs, depending on how you pronounce them. And so we're not, writing words anymore using letters or characters. We're using these images. And it could also be very intertextual. You could be writing very formally and switching to something that's very informal at any moment. So the internet really gives us this flexibility and this fluidity of being able to write in different styles. So think about the spelling conventions that you have, on the internet. So way back when, in the wild, wild west, before they had, these conventions, right? You could really do anything, right? You could write in all caps. I remember when I was in middle school, I used to write in lowercase, uppercase, right? And that was something that you did, and you use all these different. Before they had emojis, they had emoticons. And so you use punctuation that would form a smiley face. You would you could capitalize things ironically now. You could word lengthen. You could spell things as a means of frustration. So, ASDF, SAF, GDFN doesn't really mean anything. It's not really an acronym. But, if you use the internet, you can automatically recognize this as a sign of frustration. And there's also different lexical items. So, for example, LOL means something very different right like now. It's not necessarily used as a laugh out loud anymore, right? It's kind of to use as a sign that to ease attention, even if something isn't laughing out loud. You want to kind of maintain that you're not very serious. BRB, right? HMU. So these different spellings or letters or acronyms are being used in various forms nowadays, and it's not necessarily part of the speech that we've used before in the past. So, the ways that people laugh in other languages. Like if you were able to use LOL, you'd understand what that means. But in other cultures, they'll use things like KKK or ja 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 for ha 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 if you speak Spanish. French has a variety of different onomatopoeia, laughter, depending on their, who they're speaking to or in what sort of different contexts. But they also have MDR, right? Mort de rire, dying of laughter. And Chinese, if they have different characters for laughing. And if you use number 5, that could be pronounced as woo 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 woo. And the same thing for number 8. So sometimes Chinese speakers will use 8 as a sign off because that means bye or bop. So there's different dialects on the internet, and people's dialects form in their early stages of being in a community. You're not really sure, exactly when you enter an internet community. Maybe you'll use a regular speech pattern, and then you'll start to pick up the kinds of usage styles within that community. So you'll notice that there's different dialects in social networks. So how you would speak on Twitter might be very different from how you speak on Facebook, and that could be because of the word count or the character count. You're only allowed certain characters, but how you adjust your social media writing or social media presence as regards to language can depend on who your audience is. What about the regional dialects that we talked about earlier? What about if you have Southern English or if you have a Boston accent? What are some ways in which you can use the regional dialects? Does the internet actually reduce these regional dialects? And in searching linguists use what's called corpus studies, and so what they're able to do is use big amounts of data to look at some of the trends. So they looked that tweets using hashtags had less regional variation. But if they were responding directly to people, they had more regional variation. So, in a tweet, you're less likely to say y'all, right? Because you probably don't want to index yourself as Southern unless you're branding yourself in a certain way. But if you were to respond to someone and y'all is something that's very natural for you, then you would use that kind of discourse. So they found with the study and using hashtags, you're able to index this kind of professional social media self, your Twitter self, and it had less regional variation versus if you were just responding to someone very informally. So this is a graph or a map of the different acronyms or internet speak that they have. Some of you might be familiar with this. Some of them I had to look up. So you could see that in the inception stages of these words, they're grouped in certain cities. So, for example, this you have a dash and you have two underscores and you have a dash to kind of illustrate that you might be, have disdain over something. This develops in parts of, California and in Florida and New York, and then over time it grew. And so you'll see these words being populated in various cities, and then grow out to different parts of the country. So you'll see also it's a different kind of spelling, but they have what's called lead speak, or this could be replicated with numbers, or called a lead speak. So this is really just alternate using alternating spellings and numbers to confuse people, to joke about something. They're not misspelling on purpose. They kind of want to index, that they're very humorous, or this is kind of their particular way of representing something. So, for example, the Doge meme. If you're familiar with the Doge meme, you'll know that it's a dog, but the way that the dog uses language is not really a proper English or standard English. It's things like wow, much popular, so such relevance, never forget, making history, fame, so meme, right? So you're able to kind of replicate the kinds of language usages that they have in a particular community, which makes the meme that much more specialized or funny. Lolcats also uses this trend. If you remember Lolcats, and think about the ways in which Tumblr uses dialects versus 4chan. Very different depending on what kind of discourse community that you're from. So let's talk about emojis. Emojis are they come from the Japanese electronic moji, or it's like a picture character, right? So it began in 1997. They'll use these kind of smileys to indicate whatever emotion that they're feeling. This is kind of very similar to emoticons. So emoticons, instead of using these pictures, they would use these punctuations. And so this began a little bit earlier. So, for example, you could use a semicolon and a dash and a parentheses to make a smiley face. And so, some of the differences are that you really can't use punctuation to, have a picture of someone bowing, for example, but you can with emojis. Um, Emojis also, you can change the different colors. They didn't used to have that. And so, as the more that we try to use these picture characters, the more that we're kind of identifying with these emojis. Whereas, no one would say, this is my emoticon, right? That smiley face that you just made out of these different punctuation characters, that definitely looks like me. I don't think people would say that now. So these um, moments of using language or using these pictures to kind of represent yourself is really, sparks a move in language change. This is something that's very, very different, and it'd be very interesting to see where it goes in the future. Now, are emojis considered a language? Because sometimes you can type in whole conversations using emojis. I have a friend who, instead of responding with like yes or no, they'll just respond with a thumbs up, or they'll respond with an emoji. And it we would not say it is a language, just because, if you consider all of the elements of a language in the first two PowerPoint slides, right? So an emoji is really, there's no syntax, right? So um, there's no way that you could, kind of create another response. It doesn't really allow for a lot of creation because there's lots of repetition. And emojis also are very context specific. So, you're using an emoji to represent one emotion, but that can be very different when you're using it to another speaker or in another context or another language. So emojis are more like gestures. Emojis are kind of this paralinguistic markers that help you with your speech, right? So if you were to say "I'm fine" with the smiley face, that could be very different from "I'm fine" with an upside down smiley face. So using these different emojis can kind of create the kind of gestures as if like you were smiling when you said that, or if you're frowning when you said that, or if you emphasize "I'm fine," versus "I'm fine." So these emojis really help to enhance the language. I would not say that they are a language in and of themselves. So very similar to raising your eyebrow or shrugging your shoulders or furrowing your brow. They add extra meaning, but they don't necessarily create meaning by themselves. So, artificial languages. Artificial languages are languages that are not naturally derived, so they are consciously modified or created by a group, right? So they are not a product of evolving naturally. They're not pigeons. They're not creoles. They are languages created for specific purpose or a way to unite a certain people. It could be, to bring a fictional world to life, or to interface with other systems, such as computers, for example, a computer language. So these are some ways in which, we try to create languages. Here's an example of an episode of The Big Bang Theory, in which the two main characters they try to speak Klingon and try to confuse the other characters into not being able to decipher what they're saying. So artificial languages can go in one or two ways. One of the ways is a priori languages. So these are types of languages in which they try to go beyond the true language or the core roots of language. So if you took my MLL 190 class, you're able to kind of discern as to what are the original origins of language, right? Why do people create language? And a lot of people believe we created language because it's a means of expressing emotion, or we as a species started out as songwriters, like birds. And so we sung things out of song, and then over time, language was created from that. So they created this language called Soul, and it's a universal language based on the principle. of the tones of music, and you can kind of see an example of soul soul here. Again, these are one of the YouTube comments that I saw that they said, "Oh, this is so beautiful. Why don't we speak this language?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, a positive YouTube comment. What is this?" And the other way in which an artificial language can be created is a posteriori language, which is patterned after a real language, but they edit it or they modify it in a way that simplifies it. Because the truth of the matter is, languages are complicated, especially, real languages are very complicated. English is very complicated. And so, if you want to get rid of the hegemony of English, one of the ways that you could do that is by creating, a language that could be considered kind of like a worldly tongue. Like everyone has the ability to learn instead of English, right? So these types of artificial languages are, they serve some sort of communicative aspirational goal. So that means that if you don't want English to get rid of all these heritage languages, or if you want to preserve some languages, um, it's very there's a different power dynamic to asking somebody to speak in one's language. And so often, what would happen is, to live in a kind of utopic society, one would create a language and they would say, we're not going to speak English, we're not going to speak anyone's tongue, we're going to create our own tongue. And so this is kind of what they did with some of these artificial languages. Sometimes the languages can be engineered for a specific purpose. So, for example, they wanted to look at the ways in which babies could pick up on language. So, instead of using a language, instead of being biased in a certain language, they might make one up and see if the babies respond. And then some of them are very artistic languages. So, here's a Wikipedia link of some artificial constructed languages, what they call Konglang, to help you kind of give you a sense of, these are created for a specific purpose. And so some of the programming languages you have are Fortran or Smalltalk or some of the computer languages. The international languages, you have things like Esperanto or Volapük. Simplified languages, Bliss symbols, artificial intelligence languages, Shrewdlu. So, linguists will work together with computational scientists and try to figure out, what are some ways in which we can communicate with computers, computer systems, and network systems to relay information. So, just to give you an example of some of the languages that are made in this kind of utopic sense of, okay, everyone has a shared tongue, is Esperanto. Esperanto is probably the best known example. As a note, you can also learn Esperanto right now on Duolingo, and this is supposed to be this created language where it's very easy to learn, right? So instead of learning Spanish or French or German or Chinese or Korean, you can learn Esperanto. And it's created as a means of, peace, right? Instead of fighting over these different languages, you can learn this different language. And it's based on some of the Indo-European languages. So, telefono, teatro, arto, musico, anglo, familio. So you're, as an English speaker, you can kind of pick up on some of these words already. A very simple phonological system, very simple grammar, right? Very easy to learn, and so it doesn't take as much time at all. The rules, right? They don't have irregular words. You just add an O for a noun, or an A for an adjective, and so you're able to kind of figure out based on these rules, what does this word mean? So here's some examples. Hispanio estas tre bella lando. So you can kind of guess what this word means. I think it means Spanish is a very beautiful language. Or Spain is a very beautiful land. That's probably better. Spain is a very beautiful land. Um, Felikan Naskitakan. I think this means happy birthday. And then mi bezonas tragnigi mian Esperanton, which I think means I need to practice my Esperanto, and that's very clear. But yeah, you can kind of guess, right? You can kind of guess what the word means. You already know that Hispanio and Londo are nouns because they all both end in O, and you already know that an A means that it's an adjective. Right. So do these constitute languages? What about Pig Latin? What about Offtalk? What about Abadaba, right? They could be considered, artificial languages or constructed languages, right? But the point is, Pig Latin, it's just a very, it's dependent on English, right? So you can construct these languages, but at the end of the day, you still need to know English to understand Pig Latin. You can't learn it by itself. So here's some of the engineered languages. The engineered languages are some of the logical languages. So early linguists, they tried to look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis to test whether or not language actively evoke thought. And so they wanted to make these languages that were only based on logic in and of itself. And then they also created some computer languages to take interface with computers. And to give you an example of some of these, experimental languages, you can listen closely for 2 minutes to this passage. And what this video tries to show you is that babies have this innate sense of learning a language, whereas we as adults have lost because of some evolutionary practices. That we don't need to learn all languages that are spoken to you. So after 6 months, you kind of lose your language as a child. But this kind of gives an overview of, this language is made to test the kinds of knowledge that babies have regarding a language. So some of you might be familiar with this, especially if you're a computer science major, looking at the kinds of machine language, analog, direct execution, human readable, although that's debated, right? It's not really human readable. Assembly, close resemblance to machine language, something that's converted to. So, for example, you have C++, you have Java, you have PHP, JavaScript, right? So, the high level languages are ones that are human readable and can be translated or compiled to instructions and can be operated on. So, as far as artificial intelligence goes, computers developing artificial intelligence could create their own language. I know that there have been some reports of some artificial intelligence creating their own languages, although I think those reports have been debunked. But this is a good question to consider for the future. Like, what if computers develop their own language that makes it difficult for humans to kind of read? This would be very different. Other people also engineer languages to make it more simplified, right? To omit unnecessary things and to facilitate communication. So actually, Wikipedia has a simplified version. So if you've ever been on Wikipedia, it will have like an artist, it will have the subject. So this is like an article about Anna Kournikova. She's a Russian American tennis player, right? And so, there's lots of information about her. But if you are, someone learning English for the first time for ESL, if you are dyslexic, if you are, if you don't want to read that much about Anna Kournikova, but just want to get to the facts, right? Then there is a simple English Wikipedia. And so this has been a project from Wikipedia for a number of years where they try to go and simplify articles. And so they have it's a separate website, actually. I think it's, if you Google simple English Wikipedia. But an example of Anna Kournikova, right? So it says, she's where she's from and how many, Grand Slams she's won, and But very interesting is that, despite, in comparison to her, in comparison to her full Wikipedia page, her simple English Wikipedia page mentions that her boyfriend is Enrique Iglesias. So apparently, the editor of the simple English Wikipedia page thinks that that is a very important detail. So, what are the differences between artificial versus fictional languages? So, artificial languages are made for humans, right? They're made in this kind of idealistic purpose, or they're made to communicate via computers. It's just made for efficiency, right? Because the kinds of languages that we have right now have evolved, and they're not necessarily that efficient. Fictional languages, however, fictional languages are different because they provide a window to a fictional world. And so maybe you'll have fictional languages because you want to illustrate that these aliens, they have different mouth structures than we do, right? Or they don't have a mouth, so they have to have a very visual language. And so they kind of provide an additional depth to the world depicted. And it's very artful, right? And it doesn't really, it's not very, these languages are not created because they're useful or they want to create like a language to kind of unite people. They are used to display these kind of fictional worlds. So, some of the fictional languages you probably already know, especially if you've read Lord of the Rings, right? So, this Middle Earth languages, Tolkien was a linguist, and he actually, true fact, he wrote the Lord of the Rings books because he had written this entire language before. So, after he wrote the language, he was like, well, I wrote the language, so might as well write a book about it. The same thing if you've ever read Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune. He wrote this, language of the Iraqi people, and then, wrote the book. So here's an example of Elvish, sorry, from Lord of the Rings, and also Star Trek Into Darkness. And Esperanto from earlier. So you can kind of compare these different languages, Esperanto being an artificial language versus Star Trek and Elvish for being, or Klingon, sorry, and Elvish for being fictional languages. Arrival, if you've ever seen this movie, it kind of looks at the ways in which, humans and aliens make contact for the first time. So, how are we able to communicate? And it kind of goes to those the differences in the of visual language. So, what is the purpose of using these languages in these films? What are the drawbacks? What are the benefits? For one of the benefits, it could be that you're able to understand a little bit about the world, right? So, for example, if you're watching or not Lord of the Rings, you're watching Game of Thrones, and you hear the character speaking Dothraki, you're able to kind of sense like, okay, they're familiar. They're not familiar to me. They're kind of like a foreign culture. They have their own kind of history, their own heritage, right? Um, but then you're not able to understand them, and you're able to kind of reference them as being foreign, and so it kind of contributes to this idea that if you don't speak English, you're foreign. So yeah, so you can kind of type on the discussion boards what you believe to be the purpose. And just to talk very briefly about the ways in which we process language. And so, again, a lot of you are learning this in your classes about natural language processing. So, how are we able to kind of communicate artificial intelligence with the kinds of interactions between humans and computers? So, some of you are saying, well, is it really that hard? Like, why don't you just import the number of data from a dictionary or import the number of Google searches? Wouldn't it be very easy to kind of understand how language is formed? Right? And, a lot of people think that this is very easy, but it's actually very hard because Like we mentioned, human language is very ambiguous, right? So, for example, if I said Jack drank the wine on the table, it was red and round. Are you talking about the wine? Are you talking about the table? Are you talking about Jack? What about Jack saw Sam at the party? He went back to the bar to get another drink. Who is the he referring to? Is it Jack? Is it Sam? Jack saw Sam at the party. He clearly had drank too much, right? Drunk too much. So we don't really know, we can't classify the kinds of ambiguity because it requires world knowledge, it requires all these different paralinguistic markers that I talked about earlier to define what he means. And also, ambiguity is explosive. So, think about the numbers of interpretations that you could have, right? So, for example, I saw the man with the telescope has two different meanings. Either, I saw a man with my telescope, or I saw the man using my telescope. And, the more that you have in sentences, in your sentence structure, remember that language can create all these different recursive combinations, the more parsons that you have. So I saw the man on the hill with a telescope. I saw the man on the hill in Texas with a telescope. I saw the man on the hill in Texas with the telescope at noon. I saw the man on the hill in Texas with the telescope at noon on Monday, right? So we're not really sure. There's different kinds of meanings that you could associate with each sentence, and the amount of ambiguity is just astounding. And you're expecting a machine to do that? It's very, very difficult. Not to say that it can't be done, but it's very difficult. So a lot of these jokes really rely on this ambiguity of language, right? So Groucho Marx would say, "One morning I saw an elephant in my pajamas. How you got into my pajamas, I'll never know," right? So I'm imagining him saying that in a very New York accent, but he's trying to make a joke here about the ambiguity of the elephant being in your pajamas. Noah took all the animals on the ark in pairs except the worms, they came in apples. Okay, so he's making a joke about the kinds of, the prepositions that we have in English. The policeman to the little boy, "We're looking for a thief with a bicycle." And the little boy said, "Wouldn't it be better if you use your eyes?" Right? So, again, ambiguity. It's ambiguity. It's all around us, and it's very hard to communicate in this way. So here are the discussion questions I have for this week. How has the internet changed language? How is writing on the internet like other forums for writing? What would you say on the internet that you wouldn't say in real life? How do you use emojis or emoticons? Where would you use them? Either or. And also artificial languages. What kind of artificial languages or created languages that you know? Why would someone try to create a language? Would you be interested in learning this language? What would be easy or hard about it? What could you use a created language for? And if we have the existence of a global English, do we still need artificial languages? So consider these questions, and I hope to see your responses on the discussion board.